Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine Somalia, but first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. West African leaders have travelled to Gambia to convince the president to step down following his election defeat. There has been international condemnation of the ruler after he vowed to challenge the result in the Supreme Court. The United Nations has called his concession withdrawal a very dangerous moment for the country. Cuba has signed a deal with Google, which will speed up internet access to its branded content. Web browsing on the island is currently limited to slow and very expensive Wi-Fi. According to official statistics, only a third of Cubans have access to the internet. And emergency services in southeastern Australia have asked citizens to prepare for a significant increase in bushfires. Record-breaking temperatures not seen in 50 years have created a drier than average set of conditions. A total fire ban has been declared in Sydney, Canberra and Adelaide. Somalia has seen 2.5 decades of conflict, which destroyed much of the country's governance structure, economic infrastructure and institutions. Following the collapse of the Siad Barre government in January 1991, Somalia experienced deep cycles of internal conflict that fragmented the country and created widespread vulnerability. Somalia occupies much of the coastline along the Horn of Africa and shares its border with Ethiopia, Kenya and Djibouti. After gaining independence from their colonial masters, Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland united to form the Somali Republic under a civilian government in 1960. The Republic existed until 1969, when a bloodless military coup led to the Supreme Revolutionary Council assuming power. The country was then renamed the Somali Democratic Republic. That government maintained a fragile peace until its collapse in 1991, which began the Somalian Civil War. The Civil War spanned more than 2 decades and saw the country divided into many self-governing regions. UN peacekeepers were called in to end the bloodshed, but were withdrawn in the mid-1990s. The decision was criticized by many Somalians who felt they had been forgotten.
From day one, during the evacuation of the United Nations, Somalia could have been both together, but everybody left us to solve our own problem in our own way, with others also playing their game.
Out of that conflict was born one of the country's most enduring problems, that of Al-Shabaab's brutal and ongoing militant insurgency. The group's violent campaign has exacerbated many issues that have lingered since the height of the Civil War. More than 1 million Somalis are internally displaced and require constant support from international aid organizations. Food shortages are of great concerns for Somalis. The World Food Programme estimates that much of Somalia's 11 million population suffer from food insecurity. And nearly 3/4 of Somalis live on less than $2 a day. Some 40% live in extreme poverty. However, the IMF believes the country's finances are improving. Economic growth in 2016 is projected at 3.7%, largely driven by the construction, telecommunications and service sectors. And despite a predicted slowdown in 2017, the country should be maintaining a strong level of growth through until 2019. Whether or not the strength of the economy will be reflected in the lives of most Somalis is yet to be seen. And still with me today, Idil Osman and Laura Hammond. Idil Osman, do you think that growth will come, and will people feel that the country is going to a better place?
I mean, things are different than what they were like, let's say, 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. You know, we've got elections coming up now in the end of this month, which is the second elections that's taken place of a permanent government. Last one was held in 2012. There's still not a one man, one vote kind of system, but it's a lot better than the way the election process took place 4 years ago. So there's progress, and albeit slow. And I think once you have strengthened institutions that are put in place, the economic benefit will then trickle on to the rest of the country. There's also a lot of security operations that are happening, even though, you know, as you've mentioned in the report, Al-Shabaab has a strong presence. We've also found out recently that ISIS is growing in their presence. But there's also a lot of security operations that are happening as a result of AMISOM being there and international community putting a lot of emphasis on that. So there's more widespread security that's becoming more prevalent. So once that happens and continues to grow, I think economic benefit will come from that. Somalis have a very strong entrepreneurial spirit. You've seen a lot of, you know, growth that was already happening without national investment or institutional investment from the telecommunications business, other sort of informal ways of doing business. So I think with more peace and stability, the economic growth will come.
Is there a big urban versus countryside divide, though, here? Will this economic prosperity spread out to the rural areas?
I think there is a huge divide between the rural and urban areas. Most of the economic recovery that we've seen really is centered on the major towns, not even really the capital, Mogadishu, Kismayo, one of the main ports, the northern port town of Bosaso. So you see those really booming, business booming there, but the benefit hasn't really accrued out to the rural areas. Saudi Arabia recently announced that it was going to ban all livestock imports from Somalia because of fears of Rift Valley fever. Whether those fears are founded or not is not really clear.
This is the last thing, what's left of the agriculture.
Absolutely, that's what the rural economy depends on.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, not only is the rural economy not increasing at the same level as the urban areas, it's actually really suffering from a major crisis.
So are we seeing a migration of youth, that opportunities exist in the towns and cities? So youth, if they can, go to the towns and cities. And therefore,
beyond.
And beyond, leave the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen the refugee crisis in, you know, the last year and this year of those that are coming to the European shores. Majority of them, if they're not from Syria, they tend to be from the Horn of Africa and then dominated by Somalis and Eritreans. And majority of them are looking for opportunities to better their lives. So if it can't be found in their hometowns and villages, they'll look for it in urban areas and they'll look for it in shores beyond their countries.
But feeding people, wherever they are, is a challenge, isn't it, for Somalia right now? And that can only get worse if its native agriculture industry is further starved of resources, starved of human beings to actually man it.
It is. It's a problem, particularly because of the security situation. Somalia should be able to feed itself. As we saw in 2011.
It's got the resources to do it.
It does. In 2011, there was a major famine in Somalia. It happened in precisely what should be the breadbasket of the country, in between these two great rivers. That was really the place where most of the cereal production comes from in the country. The reason that economic production failed in that area was for the most part because of insecurity and inability to access, inability to move around. There was drought, but that was just another layer that came on top of the situation. So I mean, Somalis.
But these are the lawless areas, aren't they, where the terrorists tend to focus their activities?
So Al-Shabaab tends to be in place in many of the rural areas, still in southern Somalia. They're not so much in the urban centers. And so it's very difficult to move food in and out. It's very difficult to provide services for the government that's sitting in Mogadishu. It's very difficult for relatives who are living abroad sometimes to get their fundings, remittances back to the families who are in these areas under Al-Shabaab control. That's the real problem.
Can any government tackle that phenomenon, or do you think the country has to grow stronger and some of these institutions that have been so badly damaged over the last 20 years have to sort of grow in critical mass first, and then maybe that expertise or that entrepreneurial spirit, call it what you may, will then spread inland again to the more rural areas?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, you know, there's several compounding problems here. One is competing vested interests. You've got an international community that are all, whose heart is in the right place, but there's not a clear coherence in terms of working together, having an international framework where they all have a similar vision and a similar kind of aim for Somalia. So you've got the UN that's working there, you've got the EU that's working, and then you've got member states and individual countries.
But nothing's joined up?
But not a lot of, joined up operations is happening. Then you've got vested interest that's happening, that's within the country, and then regional vested interest. Kenya has its own interest, Ethiopia has its own interest. So in order for the security problems that are arising from groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS to be addressed, we need to have more of a consolidated effort that is rooting and focused on generating security and stability in the country first, and then the economic growth and better sort of quality of life and all of that, I think will come as a result of that.
But there's a tricky interdependency, isn't it?
Yeah,
Which comes
exactly.
first, the cart and the horse?
It's a catch-22 situation, yes.
I think also there's an issue in that Somalia hasn't had a government, an effective government for 25 years now.
Yeah.
And so people in the meantime have got on with things. So in a sense, there isn't a complete absence of rule of law. What there is local rule of law. There are local community structures, clan structures, local religious structures that provide that peace and security or protection, if you like. And people, in some sense, need to be convinced of the value of a state, of a government and a state. And that's partly what they're involved in right now as they move towards elections.
Because a whole generation, as you say, has grown up with this model.
Exactly.
So maybe they don't believe in Somalia as one country, or they have no experience of it.
Some don't. Some definitely don't see it as one country. Some see it. There's been a process now of creating federal governments and federal states, and that's been an important process of discussion around what actually do you want from a state. Do you want power to be vested in the capital? Do you want it to be vested in these regional capitals and regional sort of units? What should that relationship between federal, state, and region and central level look like? And so that takes a long time, of course, but it also needs to have a real tangible impact on people's lives. So it needs, ultimately, the state needs to be able to provide healthcare and education and access to food and access to jobs. And if it can't do that, people don't see the point in a state. So it's a very difficult
And is it in that place yet?
No.
Can the state help with any
Not
of
at
those
all.
things?
Not yet.
No.
Not for a
You
long
find
time.
your own luck. You
Yes.
find your own supply of food. You tend to find your own education is not formalized as many Western
Yeah, and
countries
in
have.
addition to that, there's also the normalization of violence, people taking, protection into their own hands. So that's where I think, the government can play a major role in terms of monopolizing violence. But in order for the government to be able to do that, they have to show that peace, that, there's a sort of a better incentive for people to want peace than to take violence into their own hands. So it's a very tricky balance, and I think there's a long way to go before we can see any dividends from
You
that.
mentioned the sort of somewhat mess of foreign interventions. At least, is Somalia, does it still welcome some foreign intervention? It would just like them a bit more coordinated, a bit more organised? Or actually, is it grown up enough and it's wealthy enough, or has the potential wealth enough to run its own affairs? And it could tell the world, you leave us alone, we're okay.
No, I think, Laura might be able to say a bit more on that. I think, Somalia has benefited a great deal from the international community's involvement. It's been the lifeline, and alongside the remittance from the diaspora, international community's involvement has been a real source of a lifeline for Somalia, not just from an economic perspective, but also in terms of stabilizing the stability that we're seeing right now. AMISOM's involvement, the growth of the federation, the federal system, and so on. When I talk about the lack of coordination, I think that's where the improvement can come from.
The next level.
Exactly. But there's a great deal of good that's been done so far.
So, studying the place, would you be optimistic about its future?
You have to be optimistic, otherwise why would you continue to study the place? I think I'm optimistic. I think you have to take a long view, and you have to say it takes a very long time to overcome the kind of challenges that Somalis have faced over the last quarter century. And I come from the US, we're still grappling with this after 240 years. So we can't expect that in the next 12 months or in the next 2 or 3 years, Somalia will completely emerge, rise from the ashes. But I think I hope that the worst days of the conflict that we've seen are behind it, and that it is going to move at its own pace, surely, forward.
Laura Hammond and Idil Osman, thank you both very much. Now we end with our Insight Bite, a little something that we feel you should know. The reindeer, an animal that comes to mind at this time of year, is under threat of extinction. Research conducted by the American Geophysical Union concluded that the world's largest wild reindeer herd has fallen by 40% in the past 15 years. The animals that live in the northernmost tip of Russia have been monitored for almost half a century, and scientists suggest that the substantial decline is related to a rise in temperatures and industrial development. At its peak, the population was over 1 million. Officials now suggest the number has dwindled to just 600,000. Well, that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Inside.